They say love makes you blind, but heartbreak? That's what opens your eyes to who you really are. My name is Zara Chen, and 6 months ago, I was standing in a downtown parking garage at 2 a.m., facing three armed men who thought I'd be easy prey. My ex-boyfriend Marcus was there too, cowering behind a car, watching the woman he'd called too soft for the real world handle business he never could. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain hammered against the windows of Meridian Fitness Center that Tuesday evening in March, creating a rhythm that matched my frustration. I was wiping down the mirrors in Studio B for the third time, avoiding the conversation I knew was coming. Marcus had been pacing the lobby for 20 minutes, his designer sneakers squeaking against the polished concrete floor. Through the glass partition, I could see him checking his Rolex every few seconds, that familiar crease forming between his eyebrows. I'd been teaching self-defense classes at Meridian for 8 months, ever since I'd moved to Portland to be closer to him. The irony wasn't lost on me that I spent my evenings teaching women how to protect themselves while I couldn't seem to defend my own heart from the slow erosion of his contempt. Marcus finally pushed through the studio door, his cologne preceding him like a warning. He wore his usual uniform of pressed khakis and a polo shirt that probably cost more than most people's car payments. Everything about Marcus screamed success, from his perfectly styled dark hair to his confident stride. He had made partner at his law firm by 32, drove a BMW that he detailed every weekend, and belonged to 3 different country clubs. In his world, image was everything, and I was starting to realize that I didn't fit the picture he'd painted for his future. "Zara, we need to talk," he said, his voice carrying that tone I'd grown to dread. It was the same voice he used with opposing counsel, calculated and cold. I continued spraying the mirrors, watching his reflection fragment and distort in the streaked glass. "Can it wait? I have a class starting in 15 minutes. "That's exactly what I want to talk about." He moved closer, and I could smell the whiskey on his breath. Tuesday evening drinks with clients had become a ritual for him, one that usually ended with him questioning every choice I'd made in the past year. "This whole thing, Zara, the classes, this place, pretending you're some kind of warrior." I turned to face him, the cleaning cloth still in my hands. "Pretending?" Marcus gestured around the studio with its heavy bags, mats, and mirrors. "Come on, you teach soccer moms basic kicks and convince them they can fight off attackers. It's not real, Zara. You know it, and I know it." The familiar knot formed in my stomach, the one that appeared whenever Marcus decided to share his observations about my life. Over the past few months, these conversations had become more frequent. He'd started small, commenting on my clothes, suggesting I needed to dress more professionally if I wanted to be taken seriously. Then it was my choice to teach classes instead of pursuing something more prestigious. Now he was attacking the very foundation of who I was. "These women leave here feeling more confident," I said, keeping my voice level. "They learn skills that could save their lives." "Skills?" Marcus repeated with a laugh that held no warmth. "Zara, you're 5'4" and barely weigh 120 pounds. You've never been in a real fight in your life. What could you possibly teach them about surviving actual violence?" The words hit like physical blows. I'd heard variations of this speech before, but tonight felt different. There was a finality in his tone, a decision already made. "I've been training for 12 years, Marcus. I have certifications in..." "Certifications in what? Krav Maga? Jiu-Jitsu?" He shook his head. "Those are hobbies, Zara, games. When push comes to shove, when someone really wants to hurt you, all that training goes out the window. You freeze up, you panic, you become another victim." I set down the spray bottle, my hands trembling slightly. "Is that really what you think of me?" Marcus's expression softened for a moment, and I caught a glimpse of the man I'd fallen in love with 2 years ago. But it disappeared as quickly as it had come, replaced by that familiar mixture of pity and frustration. "I think you're living in a fantasy," he said quietly. "I think you've watched too many movies and read too many stories about strong women who can take down men twice their size. But that's not how the real world works, Zara. In the real world, women like you get hurt when they try to be something they're not." "Women like me?" I repeated, each word tasting bitter. "Soft women, gentle women. There's nothing wrong with that, but you've convinced yourself you're some kind of fighter, and it's dangerous. What happens when one of your students believes your fantasy and gets herself killed trying to fight off a real attacker? The studio door opened and Sarah Martinez peeked her head in. She was one of my regular students, a single mother who'd started classes after her ex-husband had shown up drunk at her apartment, demanding to see their daughter outside of his court-mandated visitation. "Sorry, Zara, I know I'm early, but I wanted to—" Sarah stopped mid-sentence when she saw Marcus, her smile fading. She'd met him once before at the gym's holiday party, and I could see her remembering his condescending questions about why she was wasting time on self-defense instead of just calling the police. "It's fine, Sarah. Marcus was just leaving." I looked at him pointedly. Marcus straightened his tie, a gesture I recognized as his way of reasserting control. "Think about what I said, Zara. Think about what you really want out of life. Do you want to keep playing pretend in this gym, or do you want something real, something with a future?" After he left, Sarah approached cautiously. "Everything okay?" I forced a smile and began setting up equipment for the evening class. "Just the usual relationship stuff. He doesn't seem very supportive of what you do here." Marcus has strong opinions about a lot of things. I pulled out focus mitts and arranged them on the mat. But his opinions don't define who I am or what I'm capable of. Even as I said the words, I could feel their weight. For months, Marcus had been chipping away at my confidence with surgical precision. He never yelled, never lost his temper. Instead, he used logic and reason like weapons, presenting his arguments with the same skill that had made him successful in the courtroom. And slowly, insidiously, I'd begun to question everything I thought I knew about myself. Sarah watched me for a moment. My ex used to say things like that too. About how I was too weak to make it on my own, too dependent to survive without him. She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But you know what I learned in these classes? Strength isn't about size or aggression. It's about knowing yourself and trusting your instincts." The rest of my students began filtering in. Jennifer, an accountant whose confidence had bloomed over the past 6 months. Lisa, a college student who'd started classes after being followed home one night. Maria, a nurse who worked late shifts and wanted to feel safer walking to her car. They were all different ages, backgrounds, and fitness levels, but they shared something I recognized because I'd seen it in the mirror. They were tired of feeling helpless. As we moved through warm-ups and basic techniques, I found myself watching their faces, the concentration as they practiced strikes, the satisfaction when they executed a throw correctly, the way they stood a little taller at the end of each session. These weren't women playing pretend or living in a fantasy. They were women taking control of their lives in whatever way they could. But Marcus's words echoed in my mind throughout the class. Had I been fooling myself? Was I really prepared to face actual violence? Or was I just another instructor teaching moves that looked impressive but would crumble under real pressure? After everyone left, I locked up the studio and walked to my car in the parking garage beneath the building. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows between the concrete pillars, and my footsteps echoed in the empty space. It was past 10 p.m., and the garage felt abandoned except for a few scattered vehicles. I was halfway to my car when I heard the footsteps behind me. At first, I assumed it was another late gym member or someone from the office building above. But the rhythm was wrong, too deliberate, like someone trying to match my pace while staying far enough back to avoid detection. Every instinct I'd honed over years of training suddenly activated, flooding my system with adrenaline. I slowed down, pretending to search through my purse for my keys, while using the opportunity to glance over my shoulder. 3 men were walking about 20 feet behind me, spread out in a way that blocked any easy path to the exit. They weren't talking among themselves or looking at their phones like normal people would. Their attention was focused entirely on me. My heart rate spiked, but my mind stayed clear. This was the moment Marcus had warned me about, the test he was convinced I would fail. The fantasy meeting reality in a concrete garage that smelled like oil and exhaust. I reached my car and pretended to fumble with my keys while assessing the situation. The men had stopped walking and were now positioned in a loose triangle around me. The closest was tall and thin with hollow cheeks and nervous energy that made him bounce slightly on his feet. The second was shorter but broader, with thick arms covered in tattoos and a confidence that suggested he'd done this before.
The third hung back near a concrete pillar, watching the entrance to make sure we wouldn't be interrupted. Having trouble with those keys? The tall one spoke first, his voice carrying a false friendliness that made my skin crawl. I looked up, making brief eye contact before glancing away. Not submissive, but not challenging either. I needed them to underestimate me for as long as possible. Just can't find them in all this junk, I said, trying to inject the right amount of nervousness into my voice. It wasn't hard. My heart was hammering against my ribs despite my outward calm. "Maybe we can help you look," the tattooed one said, moving closer. I could see the outline of something in his jacket pocket, probably a knife. This was it. The moment when 12 years of training would either save my life or prove Marcus right. The moment when all those hours of practice, all those techniques I'd drilled until they became muscle memory, would be tested against men who had no rules, no restraint, and no intention of letting me walk away unharmed. I thought about Sarah and Jennifer and all the other women I'd taught to trust themselves, to believe in their own strength. I thought about Marcus, so certain that I would crumble when faced with real violence. And I thought about the woman I'd been before I met him, before his doubt became my doubt, before his voice became the critic in my head. The tall one reached for my purse, probably expecting me to either hand it over or freeze in terror. Instead, I did something he never saw coming. I smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile or a nervous attempt to diffuse the situation. It was the smile of someone who had just realized that she wasn't the victim in this story. She was the storm these men had been unfortunate enough to encounter. "You know what?" I said, my voice steady and clear. "I don't think I need help after all." The garage fell silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights above us. 3 predators suddenly realized they might have made a terrible mistake. And somewhere in the shadows near the exit, unbeknownst to any of us, Marcus was about to witness exactly how wrong he'd been about the woman he thought he knew. The training I'd spent years perfecting was about to become something much more than techniques practiced in a controlled environment. It was about to become survival. And for the first time in months, I felt absolutely certain about who I was and what I was capable of. The tall man's hand stopped inches from my purse as he processed my words. I could see confusion flicker across his face, then irritation, then something that might have been concerned. He'd expected a victim, but my tone suggested otherwise. "Look, lady, don't make this harder than it needs to be," he said, but some of the confidence had drained from his voice. I took a small step back, creating distance, while positioning myself so I could see all 3 men. The movement looked like retreat, but it was actually strategy. I needed room to move, angles to work with, and most importantly, I needed them to commit to their attack so I could respond appropriately. "Make what harder?" I asked, continuing to play the confused bystander, even as I cataloged every detail about my attackers. The tall one favored his right side and kept touching his left ribs, suggesting an old injury or weakness. The tattooed man's stance was too wide, leaving him vulnerable to leg attacks. The lookout was nervous, constantly glancing toward the exit, which meant he was more concerned about escape than combat. "Just give us your purse and your car keys," the tattooed one said, losing patience. He pulled his hand from his jacket pocket, revealing a switchblade that glinted under the harsh lights. "We don't want to hurt you, but we will if we have to." There it was, the threat that transformed this from robbery to assault, the line that once crossed would justify everything that came next. I felt a familiar calm settle over me, the same feeling I got during tournaments when the chaos of combat resolved into clear, simple choices. "I understand," I said, nodding slowly. "You want my things, and you're willing to hurt me to get them." The tall one looked confused by my clinical tone. "That's right, so just—" "The problem is," I interrupted, my voice never rising above conversational level, "I don't want to give them to you." The silence that followed was electric. I could see them processing this unexpected response, trying to reconcile the small woman in workout clothes with the absolute certainty in her voice. The tattooed man stepped forward, knife extended. "Listen, bitch, we're not playing games here." "Neither am I," I replied. What happened next would later be described by security cameras as a blur of movement that lasted less than 15 seconds. But for me, it unfolded with crystal clarity, each moment distinct and purposeful. The tattooed man lunged forward with the knife, a clumsy overhand attack that telegraphed his intentions from 3 feet away.
I sidestepped to my right, letting his momentum carry him past me while I grabbed his wrist with both hands. A sharp twist and downward pressure, and the knife clattered to the concrete as he yelped in pain. Before he could recover, I drove my elbow into his solar plexus, doubling him over, then brought my knee up to meet his descending face. The impact was solid and final, and he dropped to the ground, clutching his broken nose. The tall one rushed me while I was finishing with his partner, coming in fast but wild. He threw a wide haymaker that would have been devastating if it had connected, but I ducked under it and pivoted, using his own force against him. My shin caught his leading leg just above the knee, and I felt something give way with a sickening pop. He screamed and went down hard, rolling on the concrete and clutching his dislocated kneecap. The lookout had abandoned his post and was running toward me with something that looked like a club or baton. He was shouting, probably trying to intimidate me, or maybe just dealing with his own fear. I had maybe 3 seconds before he reached me. I picked up the fallen knife and threw it across the garage, not at him, but past him, so it skittered into the darkness beyond the cars. The sound made him flinch and look away for just an instant, which was all I needed. When he turned back, I was already moving. I feinted left, then went right, getting inside his swing. My fist connected with his throat, not hard enough to cause permanent damage, but enough to send him gasping and clutching his neck. A quick leg sweep took him to the ground, where he lay wheezing and defeated. And then it was over. 3 men who had expected an easy victim were scattered across the garage floor, groaning and bleeding and probably wondering how their simple robbery had gone so spectacularly wrong. The entire encounter had lasted maybe 20 seconds, and I wasn't even breathing hard. I stood in the center of the garage, surrounded by the aftermath of violence, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. I felt like myself again. That's when I heard the slow clapping. I turned toward the sound and saw Marcus emerging from behind a concrete pillar near the garage exit. He was still in his work clothes, tie loosened and jacket slung over his arm. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking slightly, but he was trying to maintain his composure. "Well," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "that was quite a performance." I stared at him, trying to process his presence here, trying to understand what he'd seen and why he was responding with sarcasm instead of concern or relief. "Marcus, what are you doing here?" He walked closer, stepping carefully around the groaning man with the dislocated knee. "I followed you from the gym. I was going to apologize for what I said earlier, maybe take you out for a late dinner." He gestured toward the scene around us. "But I see you were busy proving a point." "Proving a point?" The words came out flat and disbelieving. "Come on, Zara. 3 guys just happened to corner you in a parking garage right after our conversation about how tough you think you are? 3 guys who attack like they learned to fight from watching bad movies?" Marcus shook his head. "It's a little convenient, don't you think?" The accusation hit me like a physical blow. After everything that just happened, after I had been forced to fight for my safety against 3 armed men, Marcus was suggesting that I had somehow staged the entire encounter. "You think I set this up?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "I think you wanted to prove me wrong so badly that you arranged a little demonstration." Marcus's voice was gaining confidence now, returning to the patronizing tone I knew so well. "I don't know how you did it. Maybe you hired some actors. Maybe you convinced some gym buddies to help you out. But this whole thing is fake, Zara. It has to be." I looked down at the tattooed man, who was still bleeding from his broken nose. I looked at the tall one, who was whimpering as he tried to straighten his damaged leg. I looked at the 3rd attacker, who was sitting up now but still struggling to breathe properly. "Marcus," I said slowly, "these men tried to rob me. They had a knife. They threatened to hurt me if I didn't give them what they wanted. And you just happened to turn into a ninja and take them all down without breaking a sweat? Marcus laughed, but it sounded forced. Zara, I watched the whole thing. You moved like you knew exactly what they were going to do before they did it. You had answers for every attack, solutions for every problem. It was like watching a choreographed dance. That's called training, Marcus. That's what 12 years of practice looks like when you actually need it. But even as I said the words, I could see that he didn't believe me. Worse, I could see that he didn't want to believe me. Accepting what he had witnessed would mean admitting that everything he'd said about me, every doubt he had planted in my mind, every criticism he had leveled at my choices and abilities had been wrong. And Marcus had never been wrong about anything in his life. I'm calling the police, I said, pulling out my phone. Go ahead, Marcus replied. But when they get here and start asking questions, think about how this is going to sound. Think about how it's going to look when they review the security footage and see that you barely got scratched while taking down 3 grown men. I paused with my finger hovering over the emergency call button. Marcus was right about one thing. What had happened here did sound unbelievable. Most people would have difficulty accepting that a woman my size could handle 3 attackers so efficiently. The police would certainly have questions, and the media attention that followed would probably paint me as everything from a vigilante to a fraud. But the alternative was walking away, pretending that nothing had happened, and allowing Marcus to convince himself that his version of reality was the true one. I pressed the call button. 911, what's your emergency? I'd like to report an attempted robbery and assault. 3 men attacked me in the parking garage at 1247 Pine Street. They're injured but still here. I need police and paramedics. As I gave the details to the dispatcher, I watched Marcus's expression shift from confidence to uncertainty to something that might have been fear. He was starting to realize that if this was real, if these men had actually tried to hurt me, and I had actually defended myself, then everything he thought he knew about me was wrong. And if he was wrong about this, what else might he be wrong about? The sound of sirens in the distance was growing louder, and I could see flashing lights beginning to reflect off the concrete walls of the garage. The 3 attackers were all conscious now, the adrenaline wearing off and the reality of their situation setting in. The tattooed man was trying to stem the bleeding from his nose with his shirt. The tall one was using a concrete pillar to pull himself upright, testing his damaged leg. The 3rd attacker was on his feet but swaying, one hand pressed to his throat. Marcus stood apart from all of us, no longer the confident attorney who had questioned my life choices a few hours earlier. He looked smaller, somehow, diminished by the realization that his carefully constructed worldview was crumbling around him. The first police car arrived with a screech of tires, followed quickly by 2 more and an ambulance.
Officers poured into the garage with weapons drawn, shouting commands and trying to sort out the chaos they'd walked into. Everyone on the ground, hands where we can see them. I raised my hands and slowly knelt beside my car, letting them secure the scene before trying to explain what had happened. The 3 attackers were cuffed and separated, their injuries assessed by paramedics who shook their heads in amazement at the precision of the damage. Broken nose, dislocated kneecap, bruised throat, all incapacitating but not life-threatening. Detective Sarah Walsh arrived 20 minutes later, a compact woman with graying hair and sharp eyes who had the confident bearing of someone who'd seen everything the city had to offer. She interviewed each of us separately, starting with the attackers and working her way up to me. So, she said when we were finally alone in a corner of the garage, 3 men with weapons tried to rob you, and you fought them off using martial arts training. That's correct. And your boyfriend over there thinks you staged the whole thing to prove a point. I glanced over at Marcus, who was pacing near the police cars and talking animatedly to another officer. Ex-boyfriend, as of tonight, and yes, he seems to think this was some kind of elaborate performance. Detective Walsh made a note in her pad. Well, the security cameras will tell us what really happened. In the meantime, I have to ask, do you have any connection to these men? Ever seen them before? Never. Any reason to think they targeted you specifically, or was this a random crime of opportunity? I considered the question. I think they saw a woman alone in a parking garage late at night and assumed I'd be an easy target. Apparently, they were wrong. Walsh's tone was dry but not unsympathetic.
I've seen a lot of self-defense situations over the years, and most of them don't end with the victim standing over three unconscious attackers. You must have some serious training. 12 years of Krav Maga, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and boxing. I teach self-defense classes. That explains it. Walsh closed her notepad. Look, between you and me, I'm glad you could handle yourself. Too many of these situations end differently. But you should know that there's going to be scrutiny. The media will probably pick this up, especially with your boyfriend's accusations. People are going to have opinions about what happened here. Ex-boyfriend, I corrected again, and let them have opinions. The truth is the truth. Walsh smiled for the first time since arriving. I like you. Stay tough. The security footage confirmed everything exactly as I'd described it. 3 men following me through the garage, surrounding me by my car, displaying weapons and threatening violence. My response was captured in high definition from multiple angles, showing clearly that every move I made was defensive, every technique was necessary, and every outcome was justified. The local news picked up the story within hours, and by morning it had gone regional. Gym instructor fights off armed attackers was the headline that appeared on most websites, accompanied by security camera stills that showed me standing calmly among my defeated would-be assailants. Marcus tried to give interviews challenging the narrative, but his claims of a staged encounter fell apart under scrutiny. The 3 men had extensive criminal records. The knife recovered from the scene had their fingerprints on it. The injuries they sustained were consistent with the techniques I'd used, as confirmed by medical experts who reviewed the footage. Within a week, Marcus had stopped returning my calls altogether. I heard through mutual friends that he was telling people our relationship had ended because I was unstable and attention-seeking. Apparently, even faced with irrefutable evidence, he couldn't accept that the woman he'd called too soft for the real world had proven him spectacularly wrong. But his opinion no longer mattered to me. What mattered were the dozens of messages I received from women who had seen the story and been inspired to take self-defense classes. What mattered were the new students who showed up at my gym, ready to learn how to protect themselves. What mattered was the realization that I had spent months allowing someone else's doubts to become my own. I was exactly as tough as I needed to be, and I had been all along. The aftermath of that night in the parking garage unfolded like ripples across still water. 3 weeks had passed since the incident, and my life had transformed in ways I never could have predicted. The story had gone viral, spreading across social media platforms with hashtags like "Never Underestimate a Woman" and #RealSelfDefense. News outlets from 3 different states had covered it, and my inbox was flooded with interview requests, speaking opportunities, and messages from women sharing their own stories of harassment, assault, and the moment they decided to fight back. I sat in my apartment on a Thursday morning, scrolling through the latest batch of emails while sipping coffee that had long since gone cold. The sun streamed through my living room windows, casting geometric shadows across the hardwood floor. Everything looked the same as it had a month ago, but nothing felt the same. The woman who had doubted herself because of Marcus's constant criticism seemed like a stranger now, a previous version of myself that I could barely recognize. My phone buzzed with an incoming call. The number was unfamiliar, but I'd been getting a lot of those lately. Zara Chen speaking. Miss Chen, this is Amanda Rodriguez from Pacific Northwest Magazine. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. I leaned back in my chair, already knowing where this conversation was headed. That depends on what you're calling about. I'm working on a feature story about women in self-defense, and your recent incident has sparked a lot of conversation in our community. I was wondering if you'd be willing to do an in-depth interview about your background, your training, and how you've handled the attention since the garage incident. Over the past 3 weeks, I'd done exactly 2 interviews. The first was with a local news station that focused on the facts of what happened. The second was with a women's podcast that wanted to discuss the broader implications of female empowerment. Both had been positive experiences, but I'd been selective about which requests to accept. Too many journalists seemed more interested in sensationalizing the violence than understanding the deeper issues at play. What angle are you planning to take with the story? I asked. Honestly, I want to explore the misconceptions people have about women's capabilities when it comes to physical confrontation. Your ex-boyfriend's reaction has become almost as much of a story as the incident itself, and I think it highlights something important about how society views female strength. I was quiet for a moment, considering her words. Marcus's continued insistence that I had somehow fabricated the entire encounter had indeed become its own narrative thread. Even after the security footage was released, even after the 3 attackers were convicted and sentenced, he maintained his position that the whole thing was an elaborate hoax. His certainty, in the face of overwhelming evidence, had fascinated internet commentators and social media analysts. "I'd be interested in talking," I said finally, "but I have some conditions. Of course. I don't want this to be about Marcus specifically. He's entitled to his perspective, even if it's wrong. I want the focus to be on the broader issue you mentioned, about how women are perceived and how that affects our ability to protect ourselves." "Absolutely."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
That's exactly what I had in mind. We scheduled the interview for the following week, and I spent the rest of the morning responding to emails and reviewing my class schedules. Enrollment at Meridian Fitness had exploded since the story broke. We'd gone from offering 3 self-defense classes per week to 8, and there was a waiting list for new students. The gym's owner, David Kim, had asked me to consider taking on additional instructors and expanding the program into a full academy. The growth was exciting, but also overwhelming. I'd gotten into teaching because I wanted to help women feel more confident and prepared, not because I had any desire to run a business empire. But the demand was undeniable, and the messages I received daily made it clear that there was a real need for what I was offering. Around noon, I drove to the gym for my regular Thursday afternoon session. The parking garage where everything had happened was 2 blocks away, and I still felt a slight tightness in my chest whenever I passed it. Not fear exactly, but a heightened awareness, a reminder that violence could erupt anywhere and without warning. The lobby at Meridian was bustling when I arrived. David was at the front desk talking to a woman I didn't recognize, gesturing enthusiastically toward the studio spaces. When he saw me, he waved me over with an expression that suggested he had news to share. "Zara, perfect timing. I want you to meet Dr. Elena Vasquez. She's a trauma psychologist who specializes in assault recovery and self-defense training." Dr. Vasquez was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a professional pantsuit but moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in her own skin. "Miss Chen, it's an honor to meet you," she said, extending her hand. "I've been following your story with great interest." "Thank you. David mentioned you work with assault survivors." "Among other things, yes. I've been researching the psychological impact of self-defense training on trauma recovery, and I'd love to discuss a potential collaboration with your program here." David jumped in before I could respond. "Dr. Vasquez has a grant to study how physical empowerment training affects PTSD symptoms in assault survivors. She's looking for a partner facility to help with the research." I felt a flutter of excitement mixed with caution. The idea of combining psychological support with physical training made intuitive sense, but I was wary of taking on projects that might distract from my core mission of teaching practical self-defense skills. "What would the collaboration involve?" I asked. "Essentially, I'd like to observe your classes and interview students who are willing to participate. We'd track their progress both physically and psychologically over a 6-month period. The goal is to develop a model that other programs could replicate." "And the benefit to my students?" "Access to trauma-informed counseling services at no cost, plus the knowledge that their participation is contributing to research that could help other survivors." Dr. Vasquez paused, studying my expression. "But I want to be clear that this would be entirely voluntary. No pressure on anyone to participate, and no changes to your existing curriculum." The proposal intrigued me, but I needed time to consider the implications. "Can I think about it and get back to you?" "Of course. Take all the time you need." After Dr. Vasquez left, David and I walked toward the studios. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows created a warm, welcoming atmosphere that had attracted me to this gym in the first place. "What do you think?" David asked. "I think it's interesting, but I want to be careful not to turn my classes into a research experiment. These women come here to learn how to protect themselves, not to be studied." "Fair point, but if the research could help other women in similar situations." I nodded, understanding his perspective. The truth was, many of my students were dealing with trauma of one kind or another. Some had been assaulted or threatened. Others lived with the constant fear of potential violence.
A few were in the process of leaving abusive relationships and needed both practical skills and emotional support. The idea of formalizing the psychological component of what I was already doing appealed to me, but I wanted to make sure it was done right. My Thursday class was one of my favorites because it included several of my most dedicated students. Sarah Martinez, the single mother I'd mentioned earlier, had become something of an unofficial assistant instructor, helping newer students with basic techniques. Jennifer Park, the accountant, had surprised everyone, including herself, by developing a particular aptitude for grappling. Maria Santos, the nurse who worked late shifts, had gained enough confidence to start jogging alone in the early morning hours before her shifts. As we worked through warm-up exercises, I found myself observing the group with new eyes, considering Dr. Vasquez's research proposal. How many of these women had come to my classes because of traumatic experiences? How many were here not just to learn physical skills, but to reclaim a sense of agency and control? All right, everyone, let's work on escape techniques today, I announced once we'd finished stretching. I want to focus on situations where someone grabs you from behind. This was always a challenging topic because it required students to confront their vulnerability in a very direct way. Being grabbed from behind triggered primal fear responses in most people, and learning to overcome that panic was as much a mental exercise as a physical one. I demonstrated the basic technique with Sarah as my partner, showing how to drop your weight, create space, and use leverage to break free from a larger attacker. The movements were simple in theory, but required practice to execute under stress. Remember, the goal isn't to overpower your attacker, I explained as the students paired off to practice. It's to surprise them, break free, and get to safety. You don't need to win a fight, you just need to escape one. As I moved around the room offering corrections and encouragement, I overheard fragments of conversation that reinforced my sense that these classes served a deeper purpose than just physical fitness. "My ex used to grab me like that," one student whispered to her partner. "I never knew there was a way to get out of it." "I keep thinking about what happened in that parking garage," another said. "Like, if it was me instead of Zara, would I have been able to fight back?" These comments stayed with me as the class progressed. The parking garage incident had become a touchstone for many of my students, a real-world example that their training had practical applications. But it had also raised questions about their own capabilities, their own readiness to face violence. After class, Sarah lingered to help me put away equipment. We'd developed a comfortable friendship over the months she'd been attending, built on shared experiences and mutual respect. "Can I ask you something?" she said, as we stacked mats in the storage closet. "Of course." "That night in the garage, were you scared?"
The question caught me off guard. Most people asked about the techniques I'd used or how I'd learned to fight so effectively. Sarah was asking about something more fundamental. Terrified, I admitted, but I'd trained myself to function despite the fear, to let it sharpen my focus instead of paralyzing me. How do you do that? I mean, I know the moves we practice here, but when I imagine being in a real situation like that, I'm not sure I'd be able to think clearly enough to use them. I leaned against the doorframe, considering how to answer. This was the heart of self-defense training, the psychological component that was often more important than the physical techniques. "Fear is normal and healthy," I said. "It's your brain's way of keeping you alive. The key is learning to work with it instead of against it. When you're scared, your body floods with adrenaline, your heart rate spikes, your breathing gets shallow. If you fight those responses, you'll panic. But if you accept them and channel them, they become advantages. That's easier said than done." It is. That's why we practice scenarios over and over, so that your responses become automatic. When you don't have to think about what to do, you can focus on executing the techniques even when you're scared. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Do you think what happened to you in the garage will happen again? I mean, do you worry that being in the news makes you more of a target?" The question had occurred to me, but I'd tried not to dwell on it. Living in fear of hypothetical future attacks would be just as limiting as Marcus's conviction that I was too weak to defend myself. "I think about it," I said honestly, "but I can't let the possibility of violence dictate how I live my life. All I can do is stay aware, stay prepared, and trust in my training." After Sarah left, I stayed in the studio to work on my own training. The space was quiet now, empty, except for my reflection in the mirrored walls. I ran through forms and combinations, focusing on precision and timing rather than power.
The rhythmic sound of strikes hitting the heavy bag was meditative, helping me process the day's conversations and considerations. As I trained, I found myself thinking about Dr. Vasquez's research proposal and the questions my students had asked. There was clearly a hunger for more than just physical techniques, a need for understanding the psychological aspects of violence and recovery. Maybe it was time to expand what I was offering, to formalize the emotional support that was already happening informally in my classes. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. I ignored it at first, but curiosity got the better of me during a water break. Saw you on the news. You think you're tough now, but you got lucky. Won't always be 3 against 1. I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling the familiar tightness in my chest that I'd experienced driving past the parking garage. This was different from the flood of positive messages I'd been receiving. This felt personal and threatening. I screenshotted the message and forwarded it to Detective Walsh, who had given me her direct number after the garage incident. She'd mentioned that high-profile cases sometimes attract unstable individuals who felt compelled to insert themselves into the narrative. Her response came within minutes. "Thanks for sending this. We'll trace the number and add it to the file. Any other threats or unusual contact?" I scrolled through my recent messages, looking for anything else that felt off. Most were supportive or requesting interviews, but there were a few that struck me as odd. Comments about how I'd gotten too much attention, how I was probably lying about what happened, how someone needed to put me in my place. I forwarded those to Detective Walsh as well, then tried to push the whole thing out of my mind. Threatening messages were an unfortunate reality of being in the public eye, even temporarily. I couldn't let them affect how I lived or worked. But as I locked up the gym and walked to my car, I found myself scanning the parking area more carefully than usual. The rational part of my mind knew that the chances of another confrontation were minimal. The cautious part reminded me that violence was unpredictable and that being prepared was always better than being sorry. That evening, I had dinner with my college roommate Zara Chen, who had driven up from San Francisco to visit. Lisa was a tech executive with a sharp wit and an unwavering loyalty to the people she cared about. She'd been one of the first to call after the parking garage story broke, and I'd been looking forward to her visit as a chance to decompress and get some perspective on everything that had happened. We met at a small Italian restaurant in the Pearl District, away from the gym and my usual haunts. Lisa had insisted on treating me to celebrate what she called my emergence as a badass action hero, though I'd tried to convince her that the description was overdramatic. "So," she said after we'd ordered wine and appetizers, "how are you handling all the attention?" "It's been surreal," I admitted. 3 weeks ago, I was teaching self-defense to soccer moms in relative obscurity. Now I'm getting interview requests from national magazines and research proposals from psychology professors. And threatening text messages from internet trolls, according to your earlier message. I'd texted Lisa about the anonymous threat while driving to the restaurant, needing to share it with someone who would give me a level-headed response. "That's probably nothing," I said, though I didn't entirely believe it. Detective Walsh says it's normal for cases like this to attract weirdos who want to be part of the story. Maybe, but you should take it seriously. The world is full of men who feel threatened by women who refuse to be victims. Lisa's bluntness was one of the things I'd always appreciated about our friendship. She had a way of cutting through politeness to get to the heart of issues. "Speaking of men who feel threatened by strong women," she continued, "what's the latest with Marcus?" I sighed and took a sip of wine. "Radio silence, mostly. I heard through friends that he's telling people I'm unstable and attention-seeking. Apparently, he's sticking to his story that the whole thing was fake. Even after the security footage was released? Even after the 3 guys were convicted and sentenced? He's created this elaborate conspiracy theory about how I must have hired actors and somehow convinced them to get arrested and go to jail just to make him look bad." Lisa shook her head in amazement. "That's actually impressive in its delusion. I mean, the mental gymnastics required to maintain that belief in the face of overwhelming evidence. I think it's easier for him to believe I'm a manipulative mastermind than to accept that he was completely wrong about who I am and what I'm capable of. Or maybe he just can't handle the fact that you're getting positive attention for being strong and capable when his whole identity was built on being the successful one in the relationship while you were the supportive sidekick." Lisa's observation hit closer to home than I cared to admit. Looking back on my relationship with Marcus, I could see how he'd subtly but consistently positioned himself as the accomplished one while casting me as his cheerleader and emotional support system. My teaching job was presented as a hobby, my training as a phase I'd eventually outgrow. Even my decision to move to Portland had been framed as following him rather than pursuing my own opportunities. You know what the weirdest part is? I said.
I actually feel grateful to him. Grateful? For what? For showing me who I was allowing myself to become. For making me question my own strength so thoroughly that when I finally had to use it, I was amazed by what I found. That's very zen of you, but I still think he's a narcissistic asshole who tried to diminish you to make himself feel bigger. I laughed, appreciating Lisa's protective instincts. He's that too. But if he hadn't pushed me to doubt myself so completely, I might never have discovered how strong I really am. We spent the rest of dinner catching up on her work and her recent breakup with a venture capitalist who had turned out to be married. Lisa's stories about the San Francisco dating scene made my dramatic confrontation with armed robbers seem almost mundane by comparison. As we walked back to our cars, I found myself feeling more relaxed than I had in weeks. Spending time with someone who had known me before Marcus, before the parking garage incident, before any of the recent drama, reminded me that I was still fundamentally the same person I'd always been. I'd just finally given myself permission to act like it. "Are you going to be okay driving home alone?" Lisa asked as we reached her rental car. "I'll be fine. The restaurant isn't far from my apartment, and I'm probably being paranoid about those text messages anyway." "Probably, but promise me you'll be careful, and keep me updated on this research thing with the trauma psychologist. It sounds like it could be really meaningful." I promised to stay in touch and watched her drive away before walking to my own car. The Pearl District was busy, even on a Thursday night, with people walking between restaurants and bars, creating a comfortable sense of activity and witnesses. I felt safe and alert, but not anxious. The drive home took me through downtown Portland, past the gym where everything had started to change, and near the parking garage where it had all come to a head. As I waited at a red light, I caught myself scanning the sidewalks and crosswalks, automatically assessing potential threats and escape routes. It was a habit I'd developed after years of training, but it had become more pronounced since the incident. The light turned green, and I continued toward my apartment building, thinking about the conversation with Lisa and the questions my students had asked earlier. There was clearly a hunger for more than just physical self-defense training. People wanted to understand the psychology of violence, the emotional impact of trauma, and the process of recovery and empowerment. Maybe Dr. Vasquez's research proposal was exactly what I needed to take my program to the next level. Maybe it was time to stop thinking of myself as just a martial arts instructor and start embracing a broader role as an advocate for women's safety and empowerment. As I pulled into my apartment building's garage, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Detective Walsh's number. "Hi, Detective. Did you find anything on those text messages?" "That's why I'm calling. The number traces back to a burner phone purchased with cash, so we can't identify the sender that way. But I ran the wording through our database and found something interesting." I turned off the engine, but remained in the car, suddenly alert. "What did you find?" The phrasing in that threat matches language used in online forums dedicated to what they call false flag conspiracy theories. There's a whole community of people convinced that your parking garage incident was staged for political reasons. Political reasons? They think you're part of some kind of feminist propaganda campaign designed to make women overconfident about their ability to defend themselves. According to their logic, encouraging women to fight back will lead to more of them getting hurt when they realize they're not actually capable of protecting themselves. The absurdity of the conspiracy theory was almost laughable, but the implications were troubling. If there was an organized group of people convinced that I was part of some elaborate hoax, the anonymous threats might be more than just random trolling. "How worried should I be?" I asked. "Probably not very. Most of these online tough guys are all talk and no action. But I want you to be aware that there's more organized opposition to your story than we initially realized. Keep forwarding any threats you receive, and don't hesitate to call if anything feels off." "I will. Thanks for looking into it." "One more thing, Zara. I saw the interview request from Pacific Northwest Magazine. Amanda Rodriguez is good people. She'll treat your story with respect." After hanging up with Detective Walsh, I sat in my car for a few more minutes, processing what she'd told me. The idea that there were people out there actively working to discredit my experience was unsettling, but it also reinforced something I'd been thinking about since the incident. The reaction to what had happened in that parking garage said as much about societal attitudes toward women as it did about my individual experience.
The fact that some people found it easier to believe in an elaborate conspiracy than to accept that a woman could successfully defend herself revealed deep-seated assumptions about female weakness and vulnerability. Maybe that was the real story worth telling. Not just what happened to me, but what the reaction to it revealed about how we think about women, violence, and power. I rode the elevator to my apartment, already composing what I might say in the upcoming magazine interview. For the first time since the incident, I felt like I understood not just what had happened to me, but why it mattered to so many other people. The truth was always worth defending, even when people preferred comfortable lies, especially then. The next few days passed quietly, with my regular classes and training sessions providing a comfortable routine amid all the external chaos. I decided to move forward with Dr. Vasquez's research proposal, pending approval from my students, and had scheduled a meeting with her for the following week to discuss the details. On Sunday morning, I was preparing for my weekly advanced class when David approached me with an unusual request. "I just got a call from someone at Portland Community College," he said. "They want to know if you'd be interested in developing a women's self-defense curriculum for their continuing education program." Teaching at a college? It would be evenings and weekends, not a full-time position, but it could reach a lot more women than we can accommodate here at the gym. The idea intrigued me. Teaching at a community college would allow me to reach women who might not be comfortable walking into a martial arts gym, women who saw self-defense as education rather than fitness. It would also provide more legitimacy for the research project with Dr. Vasquez. What would the time commitment look like? 2 evenings a week, maybe 3 hours per session. They'd handle registration and provide the space, you'd design the curriculum and handle instruction. I was tempted to say yes immediately, but I'd learned to be more thoughtful about taking on new commitments. The past month had shown me how quickly things could snowball, and I wanted to make sure I could maintain the quality of what I was already doing. Can I think about it for a few days? Of course. The term doesn't start for 6 weeks, so there's plenty of time to decide. My advanced class that morning included some of my most experienced students, women who had been training with me for over a year and were ready for more complex techniques and scenarios. We worked on weapon disarmament, multiple attacker situations, and ground fighting, pushing everyone to their limits in a controlled environment. During a water break, Jennifer approached me with a question that had been on several students' minds.
Zara, do you think what happened in the parking garage changed you? Like, do you feel different now? I considered the question carefully. I feel more like myself than I have in a long time, I said. But I don't think the incident changed who I am. I think it revealed who I've always been. What do you mean? For months, I let someone else's doubts become my doubts. I started questioning my abilities, my choices, my worth. But when I was forced to act, when there was no time for self-doubt or second-guessing, I discovered that all the strength and skill I'd built over the years was still there. It had never gone anywhere. Sarah, who had been listening to our conversation, nodded in understanding. "That's what I'm working on now," she said. "Not just learning techniques, but trusting that I'll be able to use them if I need to." "That's the hardest part," I agreed. "The physical techniques are relatively straightforward. The mental preparation, the confidence to act decisively under pressure, that's what separates effective self-defense from martial arts as a hobby." After class, I stayed to work on my own training, focusing on the more advanced combinations that I rarely demonstrated in regular classes. The rhythm of movement and the burn in my muscles helped me process the week's events and think through the decisions I needed to make. As I was finishing up, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but, given recent events, I'd been answering all calls in case they were legitimate interview requests or business opportunities. Zara Chen speaking. "Miss Chen, this is Tom Bradley from Channel 8 News. I hope you have a few minutes to talk." I'd done one interview with a local news station, but it had been Channel 12, not Channel 8. This was either a new request or something else entirely. "What can I help you with, Mr. Bradley?" "I'm working on a follow-up story about your parking garage incident, and I wanted to get your response to some new information that's come to light." The tone of his voice immediately put me on guard. This didn't sound like a friendly interview request. "What kind of new information?" "Well, I've been investigating the background of the 3 men who attacked you, and I've discovered some interesting connections." I waited for him to continue, though I had a sinking feeling about where this was headed.
It turns out that one of them, the guy with the tattoos, did some work as a stunt performer about 5 years ago. Nothing major, just some background action scenes for a couple of low-budget movies, but it does raise questions about whether this whole thing might have been choreographed. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. The conspiracy theories were metastasizing, growing more elaborate as they spread. Mr. Bradley, are you suggesting that I hired a convicted felon with a history of robbery and assault to fake an attack on me in a parking garage? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just reporting the facts and seeing if you have any comment. The facts, as established by security camera footage and a police investigation, are that 3 men attempted to rob me and I defended myself. The fact that one of them may have done some stunt work years ago doesn't change anything about what happened that night. But you have to admit it's a pretty big coincidence. Mr. Bradley, I'm not going to dignify conspiracy theories with a response. If you want to report actual news, feel free to call back. Otherwise, I'd prefer not to waste either of our time. I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking slightly with anger and frustration. The incident in the parking garage had been traumatic enough without having to constantly defend its legitimacy to people who preferred elaborate fantasies to simple facts. I called Detective Walsh immediately. "Let me guess," she said after I'd explained the situation. "Channel 8 News? You've heard from them?" Tom Bradley called the department fishing for quotes about ongoing conspiracy theory investigations. I told them we don't comment on closed cases or engage with conspiracy theories. Is this going to keep happening? Are people going to keep trying to find ways to prove that what happened to me was fake? Unfortunately, probably yes. Your story challenges a lot of people's assumptions about women and violence, and some folks would rather believe in an elaborate hoax than examine their own biases. The best thing you can do is keep living your life and let your actions speak for themselves. That's what I'm trying to do. Good. And Zara, don't let the conspiracy theorists distract you from the real impact you're having. I've gotten calls from women's groups in 3 different cities asking about starting similar self-defense programs. What you're doing matters, even if some people want to tear it down. After ending the call with Detective Walsh, I sat in my car in the gym parking lot, trying to process the latest development. The rational part of my mind knew that conspiracy theories were an inevitable byproduct of living in an information-saturated society where people could find evidence for any belief they wanted to hold. But the emotional part of me was exhausted by the constant need to justify my experience and defend my credibility. I thought about Marcus and his continued insistence that I had somehow fabricated the entire incident. I thought about the anonymous text messages and the online forums dedicated to proving that empowered women were a dangerous myth. I thought about Tom Bradley and his insinuations about coincidences and choreography. And then I thought about Sarah and Jennifer and Maria and all the other women who had found strength and confidence through training. I thought about Dr. Vasquez's research proposal and the potential to help trauma survivors reclaim their sense of agency. I thought about the community college opportunity and the chance to reach even more women who needed to know they were capable of protecting themselves. The people trying to tear down my story weren't just attacking me personally. They were attacking the idea that women could be strong, capable, and dangerous when threatened. They were trying to preserve a narrative that kept half the population in a state of learned helplessness, dependent on others for protection, instead of capable of providing their own. That was a fight worth having, regardless of the personal cost. I started the engine and drove home, already planning my response to the inevitable follow-up calls from Tom Bradley and others like him. I wouldn't hide from the scrutiny or shy away from the controversy. I would continue teaching, training, and speaking out about women's right to defend themselves. Because the truth was simple, even if some people found it inconvenient. I was exactly as tough as I needed to be, and so were the women I taught. And no amount of conspiracy theories or character assassination would change that fact. The real story wasn't about 3 men who made the mistake of underestimating a woman in a parking garage. It was about a society so invested in female vulnerability that it would rather believe in elaborate hoaxes than accept evidence of female strength. But evidence has a way of accumulating over time, building into an undeniable mass of truth that even the most determined conspiracy theorists couldn't explain away. I was just getting started. 6 months later, I stood at the podium of the Pacific Northwest Women's Safety Conference, looking out at an audience of 300 women from across the region. The conference center in downtown Seattle was packed beyond capacity, with additional attendees watching via livestream from satellite locations in Portland, Spokane, and Boise. What had started as a local response to my parking garage incident had grown into a movement that surprised everyone, including me. The morning panels had covered everything from legal advocacy to trauma recovery, but the afternoon session was focused on practical empowerment. I was the keynote speaker, a role that still felt surreal despite having spoken at a dozen similar events over the past few months.
I looked down at my prepared notes, then decided to set them aside. The speech I'd planned seemed too formal, too distant from the truth of why we were all here. 3 months ago, I began, I received a phone call from a woman named Rebecca Martinez. Not the Sarah Martinez who attends my classes, but a different woman entirely, calling from Phoenix. She'd seen the security footage from my parking garage encounter, read the interviews I'd done, and wanted to tell me something that she'd never told anyone else before. The audience settled into focused silence. These stories had become the backbone of everything I was trying to accomplish, the real voices behind the statistics and theories. Rebecca told me that 5 years earlier, she'd been attacked while walking to her car after work. 2 men had cornered her in a similar parking structure, and she'd frozen. She did exactly what she'd been taught to do her whole life when faced with male violence. She complied, she didn't resist, she survived by being passive and hoping they'd take what they wanted and leave. I paused, scanning the faces in the audience. These stories had become the backbone of everything I was trying to accomplish, the real voices behind the statistics and theories. Rebecca told me that 5 years earlier, she'd been attacked while walking to her car after work. 2 men had cornered her in a similar parking structure, and she'd frozen. She did exactly what she'd been taught to do her whole life when faced with male violence. She complied, she didn't resist, she survived by being passive and hoping they'd take what they wanted and leave. I paused, scanning the faces in the audience. I could see recognition in many of them, the understanding that comes from shared experience. They did leave, eventually, but what they took wasn't just her purse and her car keys. They took her sense of safety, her confidence in public spaces, her belief that she had any agency in violent situations. For 5 years, Rebecca lived with the conviction that she'd done the right thing, the smart thing, the only thing she could have done. I moved away from the podium, closer to the audience, breaking down the barrier between speaker and listener. But watching that security footage changed something for her. Not because she thought she should have fought back in her situation, not because she blamed herself for choosing survival over resistance. It changed something because she realized, for the first time, that fighting back was even possible, that compliance wasn't the only option, that women could be dangerous too. A murmur of recognition rippled through the audience. Rebecca is here today, I continued, gesturing toward a woman in the 3rd row who raised her hand with a nervous smile. She started taking self-defense classes 6 weeks after that phone call. Last month, when a man followed her into the stairwell of her apartment building, she didn't freeze, she didn't comply. She got loud, she got violent, and she got safe. The applause was immediate and sustained. Rebecca stood up, acknowledging the crowd with tears in her eyes. She'd become one of many women whose stories had found their way to me over the past months, women who'd been inspired not by the violence itself, but by the possibility it represented. That's what we're really talking about here, I said, not the fantasy that every woman should become a martial artist or that physical confrontation is always the answer to male violence. We're talking about expanding the range of options that women believe they have when faced with threats. Dr. Elena Vasquez was in the front row, taking notes for the research paper we were co-authoring about the psychological impact of empowerment-based self-defense training. Our collaboration had produced fascinating data about how physical training affected confidence, trauma recovery, and decision-making in threatening situations. 6 months ago, I was a woman whose boyfriend told her she was too soft for the real world. I believed him, at least partially, because I'd never been tested.
I'd trained for years, but never had to use those skills in a life or death situation. When that test came, I discovered something that changed not just how I saw myself, but how I understood the relationship between preparation and possibility. I clicked a remote, and a slide appeared on the screen behind me, showing statistics from Dr. Vasquez's research. Our preliminary data suggests that women who complete comprehensive self-defense training show measurable improvements in confidence, boundary setting, and threat recognition, even in non-violent situations. They're more likely to speak up in meetings, more likely to end unhealthy relationships, more likely to trust their instincts about potentially dangerous people or situations. Another click brought up a chart showing crime statistics. But here's what's really interesting. Areas with higher rates of women's self-defense training show corresponding decreases in certain types of assault. Not because every woman becomes a ninja, but because predators are opportunistic. They target people they perceive as easy victims. When that perception changes, when women move through the world differently, the calculus of predatory behavior changes too. I could see heads nodding throughout the audience. These weren't just statistics to these women, they were validation of experiences they'd lived. The conspiracy theorists who still insist my parking garage encounter was staged are missing the point, I continued. Whether they believe it happened or not, the conversation it started is real. The women who've started training because of it are real. The shift in how we think about female agency and capability is real. Tom Bradley from Channel 8 News had eventually published his conspiracy theory piece, complete with diagrams showing how the attack must have been choreographed and testimonials from online forum users who insisted the whole thing was a false flag operation. It had gotten minimal traction outside of certain corners of the internet, but it had taught me an important lesson about the lengths some people would go to preserve their preferred version of reality. Marcus, my ex-boyfriend, who predicted I'd crumble when faced with real violence, called me 2 weeks ago, I said. It was the first time we'd spoken since that night in the parking garage. He wanted to apologize, he said. He'd been watching the coverage of this conference and realized that maybe he'd been wrong about some things. This was true, though I debated whether to include it in my speech. Marcus's apology had been awkward and self-serving, more about managing his own discomfort than acknowledging the harm he'd caused. But it represented something larger than just one man's change of heart. I appreciated the gesture, but I told him something that I want to share with you. I said that his opinion of my capabilities had never been the real problem. The real problem was that I'd allowed his opinion to become my opinion. I'd given someone else's doubts more weight than my own experiences, more credibility than my own training. I paused, looking directly at different sections of the audience. How many of you have done the same thing? How many of you have let someone else's assessment of your limitations become the boundaries of your own possibilities? The response was immediate and visible. Women throughout the audience were nodding, some wiping their eyes, many leaning forward in recognition. That's the real work we're doing here. Not just learning to throw punches or escape from holds, but learning to trust ourselves. Learning that our instincts about danger are valid, that our assessment of our own capabilities matters more than anyone else's opinion, that we have the right to take up space and defend that space when necessary. The room was completely silent now, the kind of focused attention that speakers dream about. I want to show you something, I said, clicking the remote again. The screen filled with a compilation of security camera footage from various incidents over the past 6 months. Women fighting off attackers in parking lots, subway stations, and apartment building lobbies. Some were my former students, others were women I'd never met who'd been inspired by media coverage to start training. This isn't a highlight reel of violence, I explained as the footage played. This is a documentation of choice. Each of these women faced a moment where they had to decide between compliance and resistance. They chose resistance, and they had the skills and confidence to make that choice effectively. The compilation ended with footage from my own parking garage encounter, still as shocking and swift as it had been 6 months earlier. But for every woman in that video, there are dozens more who never had to fight because something in their posture, their awareness, their willingness to make eye contact and take up space communicated that they weren't easy targets. That's the real success story here. I returned to the podium for my closing remarks, feeling the weight of 300 women's attention and hopes. 6 months ago, I was a woman who taught self-defense but wondered if I'd be able to use it myself. Today, I'm a woman who knows that strength isn't about size or aggression. It's about preparation meeting opportunity. It's about trusting yourself enough to act when action is required. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes. As it continued, I saw Rebecca Martinez from Phoenix, then Sarah Martinez from my Portland classes, then
Vasquez, then women throughout the audience whose names I didn't know, but whose stories had become part of my own. After the conference, I drove back to Portland with a sense of completion that I hadn't expected. The movement that had grown around my parking garage incident had taken on a life of its own, spreading far beyond anything I could have imagined. Community colleges in 6 states had implemented self-defense curricula based on the program I developed. Dr. Vasquez's research had been accepted for publication in 2 major psychology journals. The conspiracy theories had faded as more documentation and testimonials accumulated. But more importantly, I'd found my own peace with what had happened that night 6 months ago. The 3 men who'd attacked me had been sentenced to various terms in county jail, and their convictions had held up through appeals. Marcus had moved to another city and, according to mutual friends, was seeing a therapist to work through what his counselor called issues with female autonomy. The threatening messages had stopped after Detective Walsh's investigation led to the arrest of 2 men who'd been making similar threats against other women in high-profile cases. I'd accepted the position at Portland Community College and had been teaching 3 sections of women's self-defense every semester. The classes filled up within hours of registration opening each term, and we'd started a waiting list for women who wanted to audit sessions just to observe. Most importantly, I'd learned to trust my own assessment of my capabilities. The woman who doubted herself because her boyfriend questioned her strength felt like a stranger now, someone I remembered but no longer identified with. That evening, I was at Meridian Fitness, teaching my regular Thursday class when a new student arrived. She was young, maybe 22, with the nervous energy of someone who'd been working up courage to walk through the doors for weeks. "Are you Zara?" she asked, approaching me during the warm-up period. "I am. You must be Amanda, from the phone call yesterday." She nodded, looking around the studio with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "I've never done anything like this before," she said. "I saw you speak at the conference last month, and I've been thinking about it ever since. What made you decide to try a class?" Amanda's expression grew serious. "My ex keeps showing up at my work. He hasn't threatened me directly, but he's making it clear that he's watching me, that he knows my schedule and my routines. The police say they can't do anything unless he actually does something, but I don't want to wait for that to happen." I nodded, recognizing the familiar pattern. How many women had told me similar stories over the past months? How many were dealing with men who used the threat of violence as a tool of control, staying just within the bounds of legal behavior while making their intentions clear? "Have you talked to anyone about safety planning?" I asked. "Changing your routines, documenting his behavior, that kind of thing?" "Yes, I've been working with a counselor at the Domestic Violence Resource Center. She's the one who suggested I look into self-defense classes." "Good. The physical skills we'll teach you are just one part of staying safe. But they're an important part because they give you options if other strategies don't work." As the class progressed, I watched Amanda work through the basic techniques with the same combination of fear and determination I'd seen in dozens of new students. She was awkward at first, apologizing when her strikes didn't land cleanly, hesitating before committing to movements that required aggression. But gradually, something shifted. Her stance became more stable, her strikes more decisive. Most importantly, her apologies stopped. She began to move like someone who had every right to defend herself, someone whose safety mattered. During the cool-down period, Amanda approached me again. "This feels different than I expected," she said. "How so?" "I thought it would be about learning to hurt people, but it feels more like learning to value myself enough to fight for my own safety." Her observation hit me with unexpected force. That was exactly what this was about, what it had always been about. Not the techniques or the violence or the dramatic confrontations, but the fundamental belief that our safety mattered enough to fight for. "That's exactly right," I said. "Everything else is just mechanics." After class, I stayed late to work on my own training, as had become my habit.
The studio was quiet, except for the sound of my strikes hitting the heavy bag, a rhythmic meditation that helped me process the day's experiences and maintain my own skills. As I trained, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 months ago, I'd been a woman whose confidence was being systematically undermined by someone who claimed to love her. Tonight, I was a woman whose story had inspired hundreds of others to reclaim their own strength. The difference hadn't been the parking garage incident itself, dramatic as it was. The difference had been the decision to stop allowing other people's doubts to define my reality. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah Martinez. Saw the conference coverage on the news. You were amazing. Thanks for showing all of us what's possible. I smiled and responded, you showed yourselves. I just provided the mirror. As I finished training and prepared to lock up the studio, I caught sight of my reflection in the mirrored wall. The woman looking back at me was strong, confident, and completely at peace with her own capabilities. She'd been there all along, waiting for permission to emerge. Marcus had said I'd never be tough enough for the real world, and in a way, he'd been right. I wasn't tough in the way he understood toughness, which was about domination and intimidation and making others smaller to make yourself bigger. But I was tough in the ways that mattered. Tough enough to trust myself when others doubted me, tough enough to act decisively when action was required, tough enough to build something meaningful from a moment of violence and fear. That night, as I drove home through the quiet streets of Portland, I passed the parking garage where everything had started. I no longer felt the tightness in my chest that had accompanied me past this spot for months. Instead, I felt grateful. Grateful for the test that had shown me who I really was. Grateful for the opportunity to help other women discover their own strength. Grateful for the reminder that we're all capable of more than we know, if we're willing to trust ourselves enough to find out. The real victory hadn't been defeating 3 armed men in a parking garage. It had been defeating the voice in my head that said I wasn't strong enough, brave enough, or tough enough to defend what mattered to me. And what mattered to me was the right to exist safely in the world, to take up space without apologizing, to trust my instincts and act on them when necessary. That was a fight worth winning, and it was one I'd never have to fight again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.